So I'm Michael Ducy. Alex always likes to give me trouble about my title, so I kind of mixed it up today. I'm an evangelist for Chef. We're going to talk about the progress that we made in 2014, and we're going to talk about what our direction kind of is for 2015, one that we already kind of did, considering that it's June, and the direction we're kind of taking it the second half of the year, both from an open source perspective, but also the Chef product itself. So, progress that we made in 2014, we really focused on Chef 12. I'll dive into details on each one of these. Chef Analytics was another key major point for us. Chef's always gotten a bad rap about being extremely hard to get started with. So one of our CEO's initiatives that he said in November of 2013, he said, I have this thorn in my eye, and this thorn in my eye is the getting started experience, and I want that fixed next year. So 2014 was really about trying to help improve that first touch, that first person who's going to download Chef and get started with it and trying to make it really, really easy. And then we did a lot of work around expanding the partner ecosystem as well. And if you have no idea what that actually means, I'll explain it. So I'm wearing this coat because John was like, we need an executive because to get up here and speak. And I'm like, well, I'll put on my coat and my blue suede shoes and I'll look executive-y tonight. Who said that? Oh, okay. Bartender, cut him off. So that's the easiest way to make an Irishman cry. I thought that would have gotten a little bit more of a laugh. All right, so Chef 12. So we worked on so the problem was the Chef 11 migration experience was not delightful. So if a customer was on open source 11 and they wanted to go to the paid version of Chef, they actually had to do a data migration in the background because it was two actual separate code bases between open source and enterprise. And then also when things like security fixes need to go into the product, we had to then patch 5 different code bases instead of 3 code bases. And so it was a real pain, not only from an engineering perspective, but also from a customer delightfulness experience as well. And what engineering really wanted is they wanted one Chef server. So the back-end Chef server, they wanted it to be the same. And they wanted it to be the same for open source or enterprise, just to make it easier for if a customer decides to buy the enterprise product, it's easy for them to migrate. If we've had situations actually where customers didn't want to renew their subscription with us, so they wanted to move from enterprise back to open source. And that was a painful experience for them as well. So that's the problem we were trying to fix with Chef 12. Chef 12, we released it in November of 2014. We open sourced 2 key features of Chef server. So multi-tenancy, so having the ability to have multiple organizations, multiple cookbook code bases, policy code bases actually, and also access controls as well. So being able to have fine-grained access controls about who can touch what on the Chef server. We also did some performance improvements as well. So we removed CouchDB, and now it's all of the database layer is actually all in Postgres now, which gave us lots of performance improvements. We actually started some of that with the migration to Chef 11 to improve performance from Chef 10 to Chef 11. We completed all of that work with Chef 12. We upgraded to a newer version of Solr. So if you don't know, Solr is the backend database that indexes all of the data and allows you to search in Chef. So those people who were in the workshop today and did those searches, that's backend is powered by Solr. So that actually improved search queries greatly. And then also we added in an identity service. And this allowed us to actually have an identity service as we look in adding in more products to our portfolio or open source solutions like Supermarket. So you can actually stand up your own private supermarket and it can authenticate to the Chef server's identity service. And then also the key one was easier upgrade or downgrade path to or from premium features as well. Chef Analytics was another key release for us in 2014. So really it was hard to know from a centralized server perspective either what happened on the chef server, so did somebody modify a role, did somebody upload a new cookbook, did a new client register themselves, or did a client run happen? And even on the client side, when a client actually ran, what did the client actually do? Did it update certain things and so forth? It was really hard and limited. We had a reporting functionality that was useful and gave you all of the information on the runs, but you weren't able to build notifications or actions to actually take place if a node run failed or if a node actually updated a certain file or something like that. And it often required you writing custom reporting handlers. And if you weren't a chef expert, getting into the areas of things like custom reporting handlers or exception handlers is not something that you necessarily want to give somebody when they're first cutting their teeth with Chef. So we wrote analytics. It was released in beta in May of 2014. The first official release of it was in November of 2014, and we've continued to improve analytics since then. It's really, really interesting, and it's really, I think it's really awesome to play around with it. I've been playing around with it over the last 6 weeks or so, and it essentially gives you a real-time event pipeline of every single thing that's happening on the Chef server, or nodes are also that when a node checks in, what actually happens to that node when it checks in. So what's cool is you can then build notifications and rules around those events that actually take place. So if Trevor, for instance, uploaded a cookbook, and we have a very strict continuous delivery process that's built around delivery and how we deliver our cookbooks, and Trevor's uploading cookbooks manually, I'd like to know about that, right? So you can build rules and alerts to actually notify somebody or have something like HipChat pop up with a notification that Trevor's uploading cookbooks and he's not supposed to be. And while he might be doing it to fix something, you still, from an auditing perspective, you need to know that it actually happened. So improving the workflow experience. So the getting started experience was painful. So I remember 2 years ago when I started at Chef, the first thing somebody told me to do was, and I had minimal Ruby experience at that point in time, and it's like, okay, RVM, or do you use the system Ruby, which is really painful, or change Ruby or RB environment, right? And so you had all these different tools out there, and like some people would use this and some people would use that. And then like you read these documentation on how to get started with Chef, and like they introduce this thing called bundler and gem files, and you're like, what is this? And like, when did I become a Ruby programmer? And it's like, well, you became a Ruby programmer when you chose Chef. So we wanted to get rid of that, and of course you would go and have to compile something, and then there's this thing called Noko what? Saying it's giving you errors, Nokogiri. And then the other problem that we had is when we went into large enterprise customers that are like, we love Chef and we want to use Chef for our large, massive deployments, and we're a big bank, and give us some best practices in how we should use Chef. And we're like, use one of these tools. And they're like, tell us what to use. And we're like, and it's not really a delightful experience. So we released Chef DK last year. So we released it in April of 2014. It essentially bundles all the tools that you need in one package to develop cookbooks. So from authoring tools to testing tools and so forth, and all of the Ruby dependencies that you might need as well, all in one nicely neat packaged up release. We also released what's called the Chef command. So there's a new command called Chef. So if you need to generate Chef artifacts like cookbooks or templates, or even a Chef repo itself, the Chef command is your friend to do that. We also hired a gentleman by the name of Fletcher Nickel. So Fletcher is the developer of a tool called Test Kitchen, which is actually really, really instrumental to the workflow that we are now prescribing to our customers. And he does some other tooling as well. And he's also beginning to take other tooling, because he's really good at building tools for developers to use to develop Chef. So he's also taking on other roles in the company to actually help guide the development of those tools as well. And then we released a new site, learn.chef.io, to kind of change that getting started experience and making it much more easier. So if you don't know what Chef is, the first place you start is learn.chef.io. And I know I've already talked to a couple people who this is their first exposure to Chef. So I encourage you to go to learn.chef.io to start getting started with Chef. And it's going to be a much more awesome experience, trust me. I'm not trying to scare you away. So we expanded our partner ecosystem. So over the last year at Chef, I've worked on the business development team. So I've actually worked on a lot of these different accounts or these different partners. So Microsoft, HP, AWS, Accenture, and VMware. We did a lot of work in 2014, and we continue to do a lot of work with them in 2015 as well. And we've also launched something that I didn't actually list on this slide called the Chef Certified Partner Program, which we have one here in the room tonight, holding up his beer behind the column. So this is Trevor. Trevor is from 10th Magnitude. He has a funny accent as well, as he's from Chicago. Yes. But we launched this program. 10th Magnitude was one of our launch partners. Accenture was as well. And a couple other smaller, what we call boutique system integrators were our launch partners as well. And this is really us going behind these partners and saying, they know the Chef best practices. They can implement those best practices for you in your organization. And it takes a lot of pressure off of us because then we have these partners that we know that are actually doing things the Chef way. And Mandy doesn't have to worry about sourcing from our particular services bench as much. We actually have partners who can do the work for us. So what's interesting, last year was really kind of an inflection point for us. So we did all of this work. And what ended up happening was we kind of started thinking about what we're actually doing in our work. And we're building all of these tools and how we actually go in and talk to customers and the recommendations that we're making for them and basically kind of walking them down this path. And what we found is that this whole idea of infrastructure as code was actually really, really powerful. Back to the font size, right, Mandy? And so infrastructure as code, if you're not familiar with it, but it's this concept of defining infrastructure components in code. And this has been our core premise at Chef or Ops Code for a really, really long time, right? And this whole idea is that you can write this recipe in a Ruby-based language that allows you to do things like create files, directories, manipulate load balancers, and all these different things, right? Well, what we found is that last year we really kind of focused on this idea of test-driven infrastructure, so TDI. And what we were really doing is we were trying to bring the practices of software development into infrastructure or into the operations team. So one thing that, if you're new to Chef, one thing that you'll always hear, and even if you're old to Chef, you'll always hear it, is that, well, Chef is for developers and operations people like to use this other plethora of tools. What we found is that what we're trying to do is we're trying to make operations people behave more like developers. Our founder, who actually wrote Chef, is a lifelong operations person, right? Like, that's what he's done for a really long time. And now he's coding. And that doesn't make him a developer because at heart, he's an operations person. And what he found is that, you know, all of these best practices that the developers are doing to actually engineer software can now be applied to how we actually behave in operations. And so this whole idea of test-driven infrastructure was really at the forefront for us last year. And so when we think of this idea of infrastructure as code, we had this gap. So because when we said infrastructure as code before, and actually when everybody in the industry said infrastructure as code, they meant everything above the operating system. They weren't talking about actually network devices. They weren't talking about storage. They weren't talking about instances running in a cloud environment or on virtual systems, or even bare metal systems. They were talking about files, directories, services, application code that you lay down onto a machine, JBoss or WebLogic or something like that. So who thinks that's actually infrastructure? Because like when you say infrastructure to somebody, they're thinking network, storage, machines, bare metal, all of these infrastructure components. And if you think of so as a company, as we started to reflect on kind of these tenants, I almost had, I think that's right. Did I misspell that? Because if you put an N here, it's tenants, like people who live in a building. So if you think of the principles of config management. One of them is that there's this idea, right, that like config management doesn't really matter or care what you're configuring. And the principles of config management, or the tenets of config management, it requires that you have a noun and that you apply verbs to that noun, right? So the noun is kind of arbitrary, right? The noun could be a machine running in Amazon or Azure or some other cloud platform or a virtualization environment. It could be a load balancer. It could be a configuration on a networking device. It could be a storage pool that you need to create. And the action or the verbs are things like create it, destroy it, update it, apply this configuration to it, right? So if you think of it, it's just arbitrary as to what you're trying to apply a configuration to. And last year, we also launched something called Chef Provisioning. It was originally called Chef Metal. And what Chef Provisioning allowed us to do is it took this idea that the nouns are arbitrary, let us apply verbs to these nouns. And so we created this idea of having what's called a machine resource. And I could say I want a machine that's running this particular set of Chef code, and I run it running in this particular cloud environment with these properties. And we would go out to Amazon, and some of you experienced this today if you were in the workshop. We'd go out to Amazon and we would create this machine for you. Or we would go out and create a load balancer. And this kind of started to expand out and like, well, it's created in this cloud environment, or this cloud environment, or this cloud environment. Let's do this for bare metal. Let's actually begin to expand out what we think of this idea of infrastructure as code to actually beginning to actually manage real infrastructure. Something else that happened last year, but it probably started in 2013, more so. I need a drink. I'm getting tongue-tied up here. All right. So containers got really, really big last year. I think more so than in previous years. You had things like CoreOS get extremely popular. And then, did that happen in 2014 where Rocket broke off? Or RKT, whatever we call it now? It was around, it's been in the last year. So containers are really, really popular, and containers are really challenging the status quo of how we think of infrastructure as well. And it's really challenged us at Chef of how we think about configuration management, right? Because now we can just put stuff in a Docker file and put commands in a Docker file, and we only need to actually create what we need to create in the container in a very small level. We can have a very stripped down container, things like Rancher OS, where it's just very, very bare operating system. In some cases, BusyBox. Who remembers writing like packaging up BusyBox to like bootstrap machines, right? And now we're actually running production workloads on it? That's scary, right? But like it's challenged the entire configuration management industry, and you know, our roots are in the configuration management industry, of how we actually behave and what we actually do. So the rise of the machines, Alex suggested that I put this slide in. Did we really need another Terminator movie? I don't feel like we did. I thought that was actually felt.
We can always use another good Terminator movie.
So if you think about it, right, infrastructure is just about artifacts, right? Your artifacts are the changes that you need to push through your infrastructure. A container is an artifact, right? Now the size or scale of your artifacts may be different. An RPM is an artifact. A file is an artifact, right? And all it is about is this idea of this delivery of artifacts. If you look at like release automation tools and configuration automation tools, they're really, really similar in what they're doing, right? So, and really, when you think about it, and you think about the tenets and configuration management, the artifact that we're delivering is actually arbitrary, right? So I saw an interesting conversation on Twitter the other day. So you always have to throw the obligatory thought leader tweet in here, right? So I made this statement yesterday because I was thinking about what I was going to talk about. And I don't think of myself as a thought leader. This is kind of taking the piss out of myself. But there's this guy, he works for Cisco, And in every single presentation that he does, he quotes himself. But this is actually a really, really good and kind of poignant quote. So it's 2014 on Highway 101 from San Francisco to San Jose. Some cars are driving themselves, which is actually the reality now. If you take that commute, there will be Google self-driving cars and probably Tesla self-driving cars as well. Around the world, there's military aircraft flying around with no pilot, being controlled remotely from another country. In your data center, there's an engineer or admin configuring a switch with a CLI. What's wrong with this picture? So what's also interesting is there's a device that somebody sent me a link to where you can put this little sensor in your pocket, and then you have like a drone that you throw up in the air, and then you can go for a run or snowboarding or something like that, and the drone follows you and like records you. So it's like a GoPro drone. So enter this idea of chef delivery. And so Alex is actually going to talk about chef delivery a little bit later, so I'm not necessarily going to go into it much right now. So our themes for 2015 are really these three areas that we're focusing on. So we've kind of changed how we think of our product lines. Chef server, which includes the client as well, chef analytics, and chef delivery. So some of the things that we're working on for 2015, so continue to improve Chef DK and the first touch experience. So we're actually adding more and more features into the chef command to actually make it much easier. And what we're talking about is for large customers who might have many people developing on Chef, and it's the first time that they actually touch Chef. With the Chef command, what's really interesting, if you do Chef generate cookbook or Chef generate template or something like that, actually the chef experts in the company can actually provide templates that they can use that when they run Chef generate cookbook, it'll actually pull from that template of the way the cookbook should actually be templatized every single time, so that you know your cookbooks are created every single time in the exact same manner because everyone's using the same command and pulling from the same templates, right? So we're doing more work on that and more work in Chef DK to make it a really easy, seamless experience to get started. We're really all about this idea of develop, build, test, and verify. So everything that we do from a workflow perspective now is all about this idea of test-driven infrastructure and how can you test the code that you're actually writing, because chef recipes are code and you need to test them. This is really, really key, and this kind of gets to the idea that I kind of talked about there for the last 5 minutes, is this idea of delivery of artifacts through chef delivery. So we're beginning to focus less on actually pushing configurations, and we're more about pushing artifacts through a continuous delivery pipeline. And if those artifacts are Docker files, if they're AMIs that need to get built in a cloud, or AMIs would be Amazon, or if they're images that need to get built in a cloud provider, that's an artifact that we're actually going to start helping you deliver. If it's something like a Cloud Foundry manifest or something else like that for a platform as a service, then we're going to help you build that through Chef Delivery. We're also beginning to work on how you can actually take the open source components of delivery, which Alex will talk about, and how you can actually begin to take these best practices without having to take the entire Chef Delivery workflow package. Auditing and compliance is a huge initiative for us in 2015 and into 2016. So we really think fundamentally how organizations have solved the compliance problem. So how many people work in a large organization, you don't need to raise your hand, that have auditing, and you have to go and the auditor comes to your desk and he says, I'd like to see where you can meet this requirement. Okay, this is how I do this. I'd like to see how you can meet this requirement. Okay, this is how we do this. And people are tied up for a long period of time kind of checking all these boxes on a piece of paper, and then the auditor signs off, and then 6 months later or a year later, the auditor comes back, and nobody knows, like, between that 11-month period or 12-month period, nobody knows if you were actually compliant that entire time. But you checked the box back in January of 2013 and everything was good. And there have been tools on the market to try and help you with this, but we think that they've been fundamentally flawed because they don't build compliance into the actual workflow. So if you think of what the workflow is for test-driven infrastructure or test-driven development, you can actually very easily start to build compliance inside of that workflow so that as I'm releasing code or as I'm releasing cookbooks or as I'm making changes to my environment, all of the compliance boxes are checked before I actually push anything to production. That includes improvements to analytics, Chef Audit Mode that we released recently. So just about 2 months ago, we released this as well. If you haven't checked it out, if you Google Chef Audit Mode, Joshua Timberman, he's got a good blog post on how to get started with it. And then also, Joshua went and wrote some compliance cookbooks as well. So right now we have the Center for Internet Security standards written for Linux in Chef cookbooks that you can actually run and apply and see if your machines actually meet those standards or not. We're working on SOX, PCI, HIPAA, and then some other more global standards as well. We're working with a European company to bring those into the open source market as well. We're continuing our dedication to having Windows as what we call a first-class platform. We've been doing a ton of work with Microsoft and the partnership with Microsoft to get DSC as kind of a first-class resource in Chef. We actually released that in, I want to say like 2 or 3 client releases ago. So you can actually begin to manipulate what's called Windows desired or PowerShell desired state configuration. And so what's cool about, if anyone's ever tried to automate Windows, you know that it's really, really painful. What's cool about desired state configuration is it essentially gives you a consistent API into the Windows operating system so that when you need to make a change, it's very easy to make that change, and you don't need to wrap commands and command lines and try to parse output from a command line that was never meant for a machine to parse but for a human to read. Anybody ever done that before on Windows? It's great. We're continuing our support for Azure. No worries. And then also Test Kitchen support for being able to test Windows servers as well, which that was actually released a couple months ago. And then continuing our support and Chef provisioning for not only for machine instances, but for other cloud providers, and then also other artifacts inside of a cloud. So things like load balancers, Azure Resource Manager, you know, we could go into things like Simple Queuing Service, Elastic Beanstalk, EMR, that whole set of Windows, or I'm sorry, Amazon services as well. So that's the idea of what we're working on. So the goal in 2015 is really to build the tools and technology to enable organizations to push applications and infrastructures through a common pipeline with compliance as part of the workflow. I just wrote that. That's actually not a company goal. But no, thank you very much. But it is. So like if we talk about the company goal, we have it in a nice marketing format of like compliance at velocity, or what's the other, go fast safely, and so forth. But if you actually blow that up, what it actually is building those tools and technologies. We really think that infrastructure and applications should be deployed as one change set together. And we also think that compliance should be part of that pipeline. Thanks.